The howling began just after the moon cleared the ridge, a sound that wasn't hungry but hateful. It was the voice of a deep and patient malice, and it brought the men of the valley to Alera's fence line with lanterns and rifles. They stood in a shuffling, uncertain cluster, their faces pale and tight in the bobbing yellow light. Beyond them, in the wider dark, the chorus rose and fell, a ring of unseen predators tightening around the valley's heart. Her small flock of 40 ewes and their lambs huddled against the barn, a knot of trembling gray wool. At the edge of the lantern light, a pale shape sat on its haunches, utterly still. It was the dog, and it was the reason they had come. Silas Croft pushed through the men, his face a mask of fury and fear. He was a man whose wealth was measured in livestock, and for a month that wealth had been bleeding away into the night, torn throat by torn throat. "He's drawn them here," Croft snarled, gesturing not with his rifle, but with a thick leather purse that slapped against his palm. "That wolf bait of yours. They smell their own kind." Alera stood on her porch, a single lamp behind her making a long, thin shadow. She did not flinch. She had grown accustomed to stillness as a reply. "They are not his kind," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the cold, sharp air. "Then what is he?" Another man called out, his voice shaking. "He's done nothing. Just sits there while we're being picked clean." Croft took another step, the purse swinging. "I'll buy him. Right now. A man's dog for a man's work. You can't handle a beast like that. Name your price, girl." The dog, Ghost, did not turn his head. He watched the darkness where the howling was, his scarred ears pricked, his bony frame poised. He looked like something assembled from bone and moonlight, a creature not of the warm world but of its cold, hard edges. Alera looked past Croft, at the faces of her neighbors. She saw the same fear she'd felt for weeks, the gnawing arithmetic of ruin. She saw men who had mocked her, pitted her, and dismissed her. Now they stood at her fence, desperate. Her price was on the tip of her tongue, but it was not a number Croft could count. 2 springs earlier, the valley had agreed she had lost her mind. It began not with a howl, but with a whimper. Alera found him in a drainage ditch at the far edge of her property, a place where scrub and rock met the long, empty plains. He was a heap of muddy, matted fur and jutting bones, one leg bent at an angle that defied nature. Flies crawled over a raw wound on his flank, and his breath came in shallow, rattling sighs. He was closer to a carcass than a living thing. She knelt, his eyes, the color of pale winter ice, cracked open and fixed on her. There was no fear in them, no plea. There was only a profound and ancient weariness, the look of a creature that had decided to let the world finish what it had started. The sensible thing was a bullet. Her father had left an old rifle in the barn, and a single shot would be a mercy. It was what any of her neighbors would have done. It was what Silas Croft, whose sprawling ranch bordered her meager 80 acres, would have advised with a condescending smile. A stray was a mouth to feed at best, a sheep killer at worst. And this one, with its long snout and lean build, had the look of the wild in it. It was wolf bait, a half-breed thing that belonged to neither the hearth nor the hunt. She went back to the barn, but not for the rifle. She returned with a canvas sling and a bucket of lukewarm water. He watched her approach, his head still flat on the mud, but he did not growl. Getting him into the sling was a slow, painful business. He weighed next to nothing, a frame of bones held together by sinew and stubbornness. Each movement drew a faint, breathy whimper from him, but he did not snap. She carried him back to her barn, the weight of him surprisingly dense, a stone of misery. She laid him on a bed of old grain sacks in an empty stall and began the work. She cleaned the wound on his flank first, washing away the mud and flies with boiled water and soap. It was deep, edged with infection, a ragged tear that spoke of a fight with something bigger, or perhaps a fall on a jagged rock. She stitched it closed with a needle and thread she used for mending wool sacks, her stitches small and neat. He trembled under her hands, but lay still, as if he understood the nature of the debt being created. For the first 2 days, he would not eat. She offered him broth, then milk, then scraps of salt pork. He turned his head away. Hunger was a language Alera understood well. She knew the hollow ache of it, the way it could sharpen your senses or dull them to a stupor. This dog's refusal was not a lack of hunger. It was a deeper resignation. On the third morning, Old Man Hemlock stopped by. He was her nearest neighbor, a man from a country of high, cold mountains, who spoke in short, clipped sentences and saw things others missed. He leaned on her fence, his eyes on the barn. "Town says you are keeping a wolf," he said. It was not a question. "Town says a lot of things." Hemlock nodded slowly, his gaze moving from the barn to her face. "They say a woman alone cannot run a place like this. They say the coyotes will take your lambs. They say Croft will have your land by winter. I'm still here," Elara said. He considered this for a long moment. "Yes, you are. But you are feeding a mouth that gives nothing back." "He isn't eating," she admitted. The old man pushed himself off the fence and walked with her to the barn. He stood at the door of the stall, looking down at the dog for a long time. The dog, in turn, watched him with those pale, unreadable eyes. "Ah," Hemlock said, a sound of understanding. "This one has been hurt by hands." Food from a hand is a trap. He remembers he walked to the far corner of the stall, his back to the dog. He took a piece of dried jerky from his pocket, placed it on the floor, and walked out without a backward glance. "Leave him," he said to Elara. "Pride must be respected, even in a dog. He will eat when he believes no one is watching." That night, she heard the faint sound of crunching from the barn. The next morning, the jerky was gone. Old Man Hemlock's word stuck with her. That afternoon, she put a bowl of food in the stall and went about her chores, turning her back, granting the creature its dignity. By the end of the week, the bowl was always empty. The valley's mockery was a constant, low hum, like flies in summer. It came from a men loafing on the porch of the general store, from the women she passed on the road, their faces a mixture of pity and disapproval. "Heard you're raising a coyote, Elara, waste of good food. You'll wake up one morning with your throat torn out." Silas Croft was the most direct. He rode up to her fence one afternoon, his own two expensive, pedigreed sheepdogs trotting at his horse's heels. They were beautiful animals, loud and proud, and they barked themselves into a frenzy at the scent coming from her barn. "You need a proper dog, Elara," Croft said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Not some ditch scum. A beast like that turns. It's in the blood. I'll give you a good price for this land before you lose it all to your own sentiment." She just looked at him, her hands resting on a fence post she'd been mending. The silence unnerved him more than any argument would have. He eventually spurred his horse and rode off, his dog still barking, filling the air with useless noise. Inside the barn, her own dog remained silent. The healing was a slow, methodical process, a testament to patience. Elara set the broken leg herself, using splints made from barrel staves and strips of clean linen. She changed the dressing on his flank every day, watching the angry red soften to a healthy pink. She fed him small, regular meals, adding tallow and ground bone to his mash to build him up. He began to fill out, the sharp angles of his ribs and hips softening. His coat, once a matted mess of mud and burrs, started to grow in thick and pale, the color of winter wheat. He never made a sound, not a bark, not a whine, not a growl. His silence was absolute, and for that reason, the name came to her one evening as she watched him move through the twilight shadows of the barn. Ghost, a young boy, Finn, from the next farm over, began to visit. He was a quiet, watchful child of 10, with an instinct for animals. He would perch on the fence of the corral, saying nothing, just observing. One day, he slid off the fence and approached the barn. "Ma says he'll eat the lambs," Finn said, his eyes wide. "Does he?" "He hasn't yet," Elara replied, not stopping her work of mending a harness. Finn crept to the stall door. Ghost was lying down, his head on his paws, watching the boy with his pale eyes. He did not move, did not tense. He simply watched. "He looks like a ghost," Finn whispered. "That's his name." The boy began coming every day after that. He never tried to pet the dog. He seemed to understand, as Elara did, that this was not a creature that wanted or needed casual affection. Instead, he would sit just inside the stall and talk to Ghost in a low murmur, telling him about his day, about the hawk he saw, about the snake he found by the creek. And Ghost would listen, his gaze steady, his presence a calm and silent thing. By June, Ghost was strong enough to walk without a limp. He moved with a strange, fluid grace, his paws making almost no sound on the hard-packed earth. He began to follow Alara as she did her chores. He never got underfoot. He simply kept a respectful distance, a pale shadow at the edge of her vision. He was an observer. He watched the sheep, his head cocked, his gaze analytical. He watched the sky. He watched the fence line. He spent hours just watching, learning the rhythms of the farm, the flow of a day, the boundaries of the place that was now his world. Old Man Hemlock came by again, carrying a small sack. He watched Ghost sitting by the gate, watching the road. He is not a pet, Hemlock observed. He is a sentry. He's a good dog, Alara said, the words feeling inadequate. Good is a word for a dog that fetches, Hemlock corrected her gently. He opened his sack and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bird. This is for the boy, Finn. He has a good heart for quiet things. He then looked at Ghost again. That dog is not good. He is necessary. There is a difference. The best guards are not bought, child. They are made from what is broken. You have mended his body. Now you must show him his purpose. He explained that a dog like Ghost, one that had the wild so close in its blood, couldn't be trained with shouts and commands. It had to be taught a job. Its intelligence needed a shape to fill. Walk the boundaries with him, Hemlock instructed. Every morning, every evening. Show him what is yours. He is not a dog who will chase. He is a dog who will hold a line. His value is not in his teeth, but in his presence, so she began the ritual. Every dawn and every dusk, she and Ghost would walk the entire perimeter of her 80 acres. She would pause at each fence post, placing a hand on it. He would watch, then lift his nose to the air, tasting the scents that drifted in from the outside world. He learned the scent of Croft's cattle, of the deer that passed in the night, of the rabbits in the brush. He learned the smell of what belonged inside the fence and what belonged outside. It was a silent conversation, a map being drawn in the dog's mind. The townsfolk saw her, a lone woman and her pale dog walking the fences in the fading light, and they shook their heads. It was just more proof. Mad Alara and her pet wolf, playing at being a farmer. They did not see the education that was happening, the bond of purpose being forged. They saw only what they expected to see, a failure in the making. Alara didn't care. She was banking her success like a coal under ash, keeping it warm and hidden until the world was ready for the light. August arrived like the open door of a furnace, baking the valley's pastures to a pale, brittle brown. The creek that marked Alara's eastern boundary shrank to a muddy trickle. The air grew still and heavy with the smell of dust and the coming hardship. It was in this dry, tense season that Ghost first showed his worth. Alara was in the small paddock behind the barn, checking the hooves of a young ewe that had gone lame. The rest of the flock was grazing nearby, their heads down. Ghost was where he always was, lying in the shade of the lone oak tree that grew by the fence, a position that gave him a clear view of the entire pasture. He was so still he might have been sleeping, but his eyes were open and his ears swiveled, tracking the buzz of a horsefly. Alara was focused on her work, her fingers probing the soft flesh between the sheep's cloven hoof, searching for a stone or a thorn. A flicker of movement at the edge of the woods caught her eye, but she dismissed it. A squirrel, perhaps, or a jay. Then Ghost rose. He didn't bark or growl. He simply got to his feet in one smooth, silent motion. The flock noticed it before Alara did. Every sheep's head came up at once. Their chewing stopped, their bodies tensed. They looked not at the woods, but at the dog. He was their barometer, their signal of a change in the weather of the world. He took 2 steps forward, away from the shade of the tree, placing himself between the flock and the fence line. He lowered his head slightly, his pale eyes fixed on the spot Alara had glanced at a moment before. Following his gaze, she saw it clearly now. A lean, red fox, its body low to the ground, creeping along the edge of the brush. It had been stalking a lamb that had strayed a few feet from its mother. The fox froze when it saw Ghost. It was a veteran hunter, accustomed to the loud, foolish barking of farm dogs. This was different. This was a silent, pale statue of a predator, and its stillness was more unnerving than any sound. The two animals stared at each other across 50 yards of sun-baked grass. The fox's brush twitched. It took a hesitant step back. Ghost remained absolutely motionless, a fixed point of warning. He was not issuing a challenge to fight. He was stating a fact. This side of the fence is not for you. The moment stretched, silent and electric. Then, with a flick of its tail, the fox melted back into the shadows of the trees. It was not a retreat. It was an acknowledgement of a superior claim. Ghost stood his ground for another full minute, ensuring the threat was truly gone, before turning, walking back to the shade of the oak, and lying down again. The flock, as if a spell had been broken, lowered their heads and resumed their grazing. It had worked. Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Old Man Hemlock had been right. His value was not in his teeth, but in his presence. She kept the incident to herself. It was too small a thing to boast about, and she knew it would be dismissed anyway. One fox was not a pack of coyotes, but for Alara, it was everything. It was proof. That night, as she sat on her porch in the cool dark, she did the arithmetic that had become her nightly ritual. The cost of the dog, the food, the medicine, the time, weighed against the value of a single lamb. A lamb was worth $3 at market, maybe $4 if it was a good year. The dog had cost her at least that much in feed already. But a fox, left unchecked, would not have stopped at one. It would have come back, night after night, until the flock was decimated. The math had shifted. The dog was no longer a liability. He was an investment, a living fence. As the season turned, Finn's visits became a cornerstone of their small world. The boy possessed a quiet empathy that Ghost seemed to recognize. Finn would bring the dog scraps of meat, saved from his own supper, and Ghost, who still would not take food directly from a hand, would wait until the boy had set it down and stepped away before eating. Finn took on the task of grooming him, using a stiff brush to work the burrs and seeds out of his thick winter coat. At first, Ghost would stand stiffly, enduring the touch, but over weeks, he began to lean into the pressure of the brush, a silent admission of trust. The boy never pushed, never tried to force the kind of affection a normal dog would offer. He accepted Ghost on his own terms. "He knows things," Finn said one afternoon, his voice full of awe. He and Alara were watching Ghost, who was sitting on the rise behind the barn, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "He watches the clouds like he's reading a book." It was true. The dog was preternaturally aware of his environment. He knew when a storm was coming hours before the sky darkened. He knew the scent of the neighbor's cat and ignored it, but would stiffen at the scent of a feral tom passing a quarter-mile away. He was a library of sensory information, and his calm presence was the library's silence. The mockery from the town had lessened, not out of respect, but out of boredom. Alara and her strange dog were old news. They had settled into the landscape, a curious but harmless feature of the valley's edge. Silas Croft still made his occasional offers for her land, his tone shifting from false concern to open impatience. "You're sitting on good water, Alara. It's wasted on this little hobby of yours. I'll give you a fair price. Enough to set you up in town." Each time, she gave him the same quiet, level look, and each time, he rode away angrier than the last. He saw a stubborn, foolish woman. He did not see the meticulous work, the growing flock, the silent guardian that watched him go. He did not see the strength she was building, hidden in plain sight. What he did not yet know was that the valley was about to be reminded that the world was not a tame and predictable place, and that the things it dismissed as worthless were sometimes the only things that held the line when the real dark came. Winter came early that year, with a hard frost in October that killed the last of the grazing. By November, a bitter wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the first stinging flakes of snow. It was a hungry wind, and it brought hungry things with it. The first report came from the Miller farm on the far western side of the valley. 2 ewes taken in a single night, their carcasses left in the snow, only partially eaten. It was the work of coyotes, but it was sloppy, wasteful. It spoke of a pack that was large and confident. A week later, the Schmidts lost 3. Then the Taylors lost 4, taken from a pen not 50 yards from their house. A quiet panic began to settle over the valley. This was not the usual opportunistic predation of a lone animal. This was organized. It was intelligent. The men formed hunting parties, riding out with their rifles and their dogs. They found tracks everywhere, a confusing web of them, but the pack was clever. They were never where the hunters were. They would strike on one side of the valley while the men searched the other. The valley's dogs were a mix of hounds and farm collies, bred for herding and tracking. They were brave and loud, but they were no match for the pack's cunning. They would give chase to a single coyote, a decoy, barking furiously as it led them on a pointless run, while the rest of the pack circled around and attacked the unprotected flock from behind. It was a classic tactic, and it worked time and time again. The coyotes were winning. Silas Croft, who owned more sheep than anyone, was hit the hardest. He lost 6 in one night, then 8 a few nights later. His pride was savaged as much as his flock. He had the best dogs, the strongest fences, the most men. It made no difference. He doubled the bounty on coyote hides, but no one could collect. The predators were like ghosts, visible only by the damage they left behind. Alara felt the tension in the air. She saw the grim faces of the men at the general store, heard the hushed, fearful conversations. She reinforced her fences, checking every post and wire. Every evening, she did the arithmetic of survival. 43 sheep. The price of wool was down, but the price of mutton was steady. If she could get them all through to the spring lambing season, she would be secure. If she lost even a quarter of them, she would be ruined. Croft would get her land for pennies on the dollar. Her entire world was balanced on a knife's edge. Through it all, Ghost remained a constant. He seemed to feel the change in the valley, the scent of fear and blood on the wind. He spent more time on patrol, circling the property, his movements deliberate and soundless. He ate more, as if storing energy for a coming trial. He did not seem afraid. He seemed focused. One night, Alara was woken by a sound. It was not the coyotes. It was the absolute silence where the chirping of crickets should have been. The air was dead still, heavy with a waiting presence. She got up, pulled on her coat over her nightdress, and went to the window. The snow-covered fields glowed under a high, thin moon. Her flock was a tight, nervous ball near the barn, and at the far fence line, she saw them. 3 of them. They stood like dark statues against the snow, their shoulders hunched, their sharp snouts pointed toward the sheep. They were larger than the coyotes she was used to seeing, leaner and longer of leg, driven down from a high country by the hard winter. The pack. She reached for the rifle she kept by the door, her heart pounding. But before she could raise it, she saw Ghost. He was already there, a pale shape against the snow, standing halfway between the flock and the fence. He hadn't made a sound. He had simply materialized in the path of the threat. He did not bark, did not snarl, did not charge. He just stood there, his body utterly still, his head low, his gaze locked on the intruders. The 3 coyotes saw him. They paused, their confident trot broken. This was not the reaction they were used to. They were accustomed to noise, to frantic, useless aggression. This silent, unmoving guardian was something outside their experience. One of the coyotes, the boldest, took a few steps forward, letting out a low, guttural growl. Ghost did not react. He did not even twitch. He held the line. His stillness was a weapon, a form of pressure that the wild things understood better than any human. It was the stillness of a predator that is absolutely sure of its ground, that has no need for a threat display. The coyote stopped. It looked to its companions. Another moment of silent communication passed between them. Then, as one, they turned and trotted away, melting back into the darkness they came from. Ghost remained in his spot for a full 10 minutes after they were gone, a silent sentinel under the moon. Only when he was certain the danger had passed did he turn and walk back toward the barn. Alara lowered the rifle, her hands trembling slightly. She had not needed it. She had witnessed a battle fought and won without a single shot fired, without a single tooth bared. It was a victory of intelligence over instinct, of presence over aggression. The next morning, she walked out to the fence line. The snow told the story. The tracks of the 3 large coyotes came right up to the wire. And there, 20 yards inside the fence, were the 4 neat prints of ghost paws pressed deep into the frost. A line had been drawn, and it had been held. The valley did not know it, but its salvation was a half-starved dog pulled from a ditch, a creature made not of pedigrees and loud boasts, but of quiet purpose and a debt repaid. The pack, having tested Alara's boundary and found it defended by something they did not understand, turned its full attention to the easier targets that remained. The nightly raids on the other farms grew more frequent and more brazen. The valley was bleeding out, and the fear was beginning to curdle into something uglier. Suspicion. Whispers started in the general store and spread from farm to farm. How was it that Alara, a lone woman with a small, weak flock, was untouched? She hadn't lost a single animal. It didn't make sense. It was easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. The whispers said her ditch dog was the cause, that he was kin to the pack, calling them in, offering up the neighbor's sheep to protect his own. It was a dark, foolish thought, born of desperation, but it took root. One afternoon, a delegation of 3 men, their faces grim, rode up to her gate. It was Schmidt, Taylor, and Miller, the men who had lost the most. "We need to talk about your dog, Alara," Schmidt said, his voice flat. "He ain't natural. Silent like that. While the rest of us are being ruined, you sit here safe." "It ain't right. My fences are strong," Alara said calmly. "My dog is watchful. Your dog is a half-wolf." Taylor spat. "He's drawing them in. We want him gone. Tied up or put down." For the good of the valley, Ghost, who had been lying on the porch, rose silently and stood beside Alara. He didn't growl, but his presence was a clear statement. He was hers to defend, and she was his. "No," Alara said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid as a stone wall. The men stared, taken aback by her simple refusal. They were used to a quiet, yielding girl. They did not know the woman of iron she had become. They muttered threats and warnings, but there was no conviction in them. They were frightened men lashing out, and they knew it. They rode away, leaving a cloud of resentment hanging in the air. That night, Silas Croft convened a meeting in the town hall. The room was packed, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and fear. Croft stood at the front, his face flushed with anger. He had lost nearly 1/5 of his flock. "This is no longer about a few coyotes," he boomed, his voice filling the small space. "This is a plague, and it's being harbored. We all know who isn't being hit. We all know who keeps a wild animal as a pet." He didn't have to say her name. Every eye in the room knew who he meant. "She's a danger to us all. Her sentimentality is going to be the ruin of this valley. We have to act." A few men shouted their agreement. But Old Man Hemlock, who rarely came to town meetings, stood up from the back of the room. His voice, though quiet, cut through the noise. "You are fools," he said, his accent thick. "You blame the one person who is safe instead of asking why she is safe. Your dogs are loud. Her dog is smart. Your fences have gaps. Her fences are whole. You look for magic and betrayal because you are too proud to admit you have been outthought by a pack of wild animals and by a lone woman." There was a stunned silence. No one spoke to Silas Croft that way. Croft's face went purple with rage. "And what would you know, old man? You and your foreign ways. I know a good dog when I see one," Hemlock said simply, and sat back down. The meeting broke up with no resolution, but the seeds of conflict had been sown. The valley was divided between those who feared the coyotes and those who now feared Alara and her dog. The crisis came to a head 3 nights later, under a full, brittle moon. The pack, driven by a deep and desperate hunger, grew bold. They launched a coordinated assault, not on a single farm, but on the valley itself. The howling started just after midnight, coming from all directions at once. It was a symphony of terror designed to confuse and panic. They hit Croft's main pasture first, a wave of dark shapes pouring over his fences. His dogs barked themselves into a useless frenzy, chasing shadows while the real killing happened behind them. The shouts of his ranch hands and the crack of rifles were lost in the cacophony. But the pack was larger than anyone had realized. They were not just a dozen, but closer to 24 strong. After tearing through Croft's flock, a splinter group, a half dozen of the strongest, broke off and headed east, straight for Alara's farm. They moved with the arrogance of victors, their muzzles dark with blood. This time, Alara was waiting. She had seen the chaos erupting on the far ridge, the bobbing lanterns, the flashes of gunfire. She knew they would come. She stood on her porch, the rifle in her hands, her knuckles white. Ghost stood at the gate, not in the center of the pasture, but at the main entry point, the place where the farm lane met the valley road. He had chosen his ground. The flock was safely shut in the barn. This was not about protecting sheep anymore. This was about holding the line. The 6 coyotes came into view, trotting down the lane. They saw him and paused. He was 1. They were 6. The odds were in their favor. The lead animal, a big male with a scarred face, lowered its head and charged. It was a feint, a test of nerve. Ghost did not move. He did not brace for impact. He simply waited. The coyote, unnerved by the lack of reaction, pulled up short just a few feet away, snarling, its teeth bared. The other 5 began to circle, fanning out, looking for an angle of attack. And then it happened. The sound that no one in the valley had ever heard. A sound that came not from Ghost's throat, but deep from his chest. It wasn't a bark or a growl. It was a low, guttural, terrifying roar, a sound that belonged to the high, lonely places of the world, a sound of absolute authority. It was the voice of a wolf. The circling coyotes froze. The lead animal flattened its ears and took a step back. They had mistaken him for a dog. They saw now what he was, not a half-breed, but something older, purer. He was a creature of the mountains, a true wolf that had, by some twist of fate, chosen to guard a flock instead of hunt one. They had challenged the alpha of a territory they did not know they were trespassing in. And at that moment, the first of the lanterns appeared, bobbing down the road. It was Finn's father, then Schmidt, then others drawn by the unholy roar. They stopped at her fence line, their rifles held slack, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. They saw the standoff, the 6 predators held at bay by the single, pale guardian. Then came Silas Croft, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He saw his own ruin in the dead sheep littering his fields, and he saw his salvation standing at Alara's gate. The howling began again, this time from the ridge behind them, the rest of the pack calling to their own. The 6 coyotes at the gate hesitated, torn between the challenge in front of them and the call behind. The big male let out one last snarl, then turned, and the 6 of them melted away into the night, abandoning the fight. Silence fell, thick and heavy. The men stood at the fence, staring at the dog, then at Alara. They had come to accuse her, and instead they had been saved by her. It was Croft who broke the silence. He pushed through the men, his eyes wild. His authority was shattered, his wealth savaged. All he had left was his pride and his money. "He's drawn them here," he snarled, repeating the same desperate accusation from before, but the words were hollow now. Everyone had seen the truth. He slapped the thick leather purse against his palm. "I'll buy him. Right now. A man's dog for a man's work. You can't handle a beast like that. Name your price, girl." Ghost turned his head and looked at Alara for the first time. His pale eyes were calm. He had done his job. The rest was up to her. Alara looked at Croft's purse, fat with coins. She could name a price that would make her rich, that would let her leave this hardscrabble life forever. She could sell the dog and walk away. Then she looked past him at the faces of her neighbors. Schmidt, Taylor, Miller. These were men who had scorned her, threatened her. But in their eyes, she saw not malice, but a deep, humbling fear. They were broken. Their flocks were savaged, their winters would be lean, their families would be hungry. They were on the edge of the same ruin she had been fighting for 2 years. She could let them fail. It would be a just reward for their mockery. Or she could choose another path. She thought of Old Man Hemlock's words. The best guards are made from what is broken. Perhaps the same was true of communities. "My dog is not for sale," she said, her voice clear and steady. A murmur went through the crowd. Croft's face tightened. "Everything has a price. You're right," Alara agreed. "It does." She took a step forward, her gaze sweeping over her neighbors, landing finally back on Croft. "Here's my price. Not for my dog. For my help. Ghost will guard the valley flock. All of it. We graze together on the common land. We protect each other. and we sell our wool together, as a cooperative, for one price, a fair price. No one will undersell his neighbor to you again, Mr. Croft. We stand together, or we fall together. That is the price. It was a declaration of independence. It was a revolution spoken in a quiet voice on a cold winter night. The men stared at her, a slow understanding dawning on their faces. She was offering them not just protection, but a future. She was offering to bind them together, to mend what was broken. Schmidt was the first to nod, then Taylor. One by one, they looked away from Croft and toward her. They were no longer his men. They were hers. Silas Croft stood alone, his purse hanging uselessly in his hand. He had tried to buy a dog, and in the process, he had lost a valley. He saw the look in their eyes, the shift in the balance of power. Without a word, he turned and stalked back into the darkness, a man undone not by a predator, but by the quiet resolve of a woman he had never thought to respect. The coming weeks were a flurry of activity. Under Alara's quiet guidance, the valley's remaining sheep were gathered into a single large flock. Fences were mended, pens were reinforced, and a system of watches was established. But the heart of the new system was Ghost. He seemed to understand his expanded role instinctively. He no longer patrolled the 80 acres of Alara's farm, but the 1,000 acres of the valley's common grazing land. He moved with a tireless, silent grace, a pale phantom against the snow. Finn became his shadow, bringing him food and water, his quiet presence a comfort to the dog. The boy, once on the periphery of the valley's life, now had a vital purpose. The pack of coyotes tested the new arrangement once, a half-hearted probe at the edges of the massive flock. They were met not by a single guardian, but by a dog, 2 armed men, and a community that was now organized and vigilant. They did not return. The predator's power had been broken by the valley's unity. When spring came, the lambing season was the most successful in memory. The cooperative, with Alara as its elected head, negotiated a price for their wool that was a third higher than what Croft had ever paid them individually. For the first time, there was a sense of shared prosperity, of a future that was not a struggle for individual survival, but a project of commonwealth. Alara never moved from her small farmhouse. She did not seek power or praise. Her vindication was not in gloating, but in the quiet hum of a valley restored. It was in a respectful nod she received in town, in the way the women now stopped to ask her advice, in the sight of Finn walking proudly beside the great, pale dog. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the greening valley, old man Hemlock joined her on her porch. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Ghost on a nearby hill. He was not lying down, but sitting his head up, his gaze sweeping across the vast, peaceful flock that belonged to everyone. "The best guards are not bought," Hemlock said softly, repeating the aphorism he had given her 2 years before. "They are made from what is broken." Alara looked at the dog, a creature pulled from a muddy ditch, a being of scars and silence. He had been broken. And then she looked out at the valley, at the farms that had been on the brink of ruin, at the community that had been fractured by fear and suspicion. It had been broken, too. She had mended the dog, and in doing so, the dog had mended them all. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, warm certainty. The valley was whole again, guarded by the love of a woman who saw value where others saw only waste, and by the loyalty of a dog who repaid a debt of kindness by holding the line against the dark.